Right, is that what it is? Okay, there's so much more to it. Dr. Hill has an extensive medical background, including a doctorate of chiropractic and master's in public health. His awareness of toxic society and coursework has developed him into an expert in detoxification and micronutrient testing. So please welcome Dr. Hill.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
One thing's for sure, when you follow Dr. Hotze speaking, you know the gloves are off and you can say about whatever you were thinking you wanted to say. So it's a pleasure to be here. I want to go through this with you, and I think it's important because I know this time of year everybody's really into the weight loss, the idea of weight loss and thinking about different ways to do it. So I want to just jump right into this. Okay, so I want to just jump right into this, and I want to start out here with this first point in that if you look at the common ideology of how weight loss is kind of talked about in the public as a whole, it revolves around this idea of we're gonna look at calories, right? And most of us, even if you just if this is a new concept to you, most of us realize after just what we've heard this morning that it's way bigger than just talking about calories, right? You can't, your body's not a calculator, right? You can't put things in and then subtract stuff out and expect the result to be the same. And for those of you that this is a new concept to, let me give you a quick example to hopefully break this idea for you. If I give you 400 grams of pasta and I give you 400 grams of protein, let's just say in the form of a steak, is it going to have the same effect on your body? Is a calorie a calorie? No, a calorie is not a calorie. Our body looks at these things differently, and we have to understand that, right? So the idea of just looking at things in terms of calories, it doesn't really work, right? And many of you may have experienced that, unfortunately. But the question is that if you've been in that rut and you've gone down that road, where do you go next, right? Dr. Hotze told you can't go get on the treadmill, you can't run it away, right? And we know that's the case. We actually know, I was funny because in the last 2 weeks, I tend to work out in the morning. And I notice around this time of year, I always dread coming back after the holidays and going back to the gym because I pull in the parking lot first thing in the morning and I see tons of cars that were never there in December, right? They weren't there. And you go in and you see where most people are at. I do most of my training in the free weights and in the resistance training areas. But you see a lot of people, a lot of new faces, not the regulars, but a lot of new faces in the cardio section. And come roll around to March, you still see those same people in general in the cardio section, and not a lot has changed. And I just want to go over and I just want to give them a hug and tell them, look, if I just helped you come over here and we just did something different in this section of the gym, things would be different, right? But we got to think even beyond that, because here's the bottom line, and I'm going to show you evidence of this. The world around us has changed. And if we don't change and accommodate to that world around us, a lot of these things that we talk about with regards to not just to weight loss, but a lot of these topics that were brought up very early on this morning related to chronic health, these things are going to continue to persist. So we want to look at the idea of toxicity and what we can do about it. Now, when we talk about a more complex world, we got to have the ability to detoxify. And I'll show you specifically exactly what it takes. Nutrients as you think about the Vitamin Shop, GNC, some of these other locations, maybe your drugstores, and they think about, oh, that's just something I'll take in terms of good health. That's not a nutrient. I mean, those aren't nutrients, right? Don't get me wrong, but that's not the concept of a nutrient. It's not just about good health. How many of you like and enjoy an efficiently working metabolism? Everybody in here should raise their hand on that, right? Because that may mean that in terms of neurological function, you think at a more effective rate. In terms of your activities throughout the day, you're more effective at what you can do throughout the day. If your metabolism's not functioning 100%, there's a pretty strong likelihood that you have nutrient deficiencies somewhere that are impairing that. I'll give this example. Take your car, your truck, your vehicle, and pop the hood on it and pull one spark plug out of it. It's this big compared to a vehicle that's how large? You pull that one spark plug out, and the whole function of that vehicle completely changes, right? That's what one nutrient deficiency is like to our body. It's a complete change on our system, so we have to know about these things. And of course, we talked about hormones, so I won't belabor that point. But bottom line is, if you want to promote weight loss, you've got to have an efficient metabolism. So when we talk about detoxification, what are we really talking about here? Well, essentially, just real quickly, it's the chemical alteration of a substance, especially a drug, so we've talked about that, right? But really, when you're looking at what has to happen through the process of detoxification, when you're concerned about a toxin, whether it's a medication, whether it's an environmental toxin, these things are not something that are inherently supposed to be in the body. These are things that when they enter into the body looks at this and it doesn't easily incorporate into a metabolic pathway somewhere. The body's sitting there going, what am I going to do with this? I'm not sure where this is supposed to go, and I've got to try to figure out how to deal with this thing. And the way that it's going to go through dealing with it is it's got to change it. Because a toxin, just by the sheer name of it, is problematic to us. It creates health concerns for us. So the more that those things accumulate, the greater those health concerns become. So ultimately, if that's a health concern, we've got to change it over to something that is not damaging, not harmful to our system, right? And the idea of, if you look at the more technical term on detoxification, it's called biotransformation. And essentially, I think that makes sense. It's actually more explanatory in some ways because you're actually trying to transform the toxin to something that's not harmful or damaging to your body. And if most of you are kind of looking at this and going, okay, I get this concept, I want to show you some real world examples on this coming up to make this tangible for you. Now, how many of you have taken a medication, let's just say an over-the-counter Tylenol, you get a headache, you pop a Tylenol, you want to reduce that pain, drop the inflammation a little bit? Here's exactly how that process takes place. You'll see on that far left-hand side of the screen up there, that's Tylenol. Don't worry about the chemical structure so much on this. Here's what I want to show you. You start out with Tylenol over here, and Tylenol has to be manipulated, and then ultimately it becomes manipulated more, and if you look at the big difference on this, you'll notice basically all this stuff is pretty much the same, but you've got something over here called glutathione. Now, how many of you have heard of glutathione? Glutathione's your friend. Glutathione's a very important antioxidant in the system, and if you don't have adequate glutathione in your body, I can guarantee you have too much inflammation circulating in your system. Some of the testing that I'll talk about in terms of how do you actually specify what nutrients you need, consistently when I look at these tests, and I look at these tests from all across the country, you will see that people that have low glutathione have high inflammation in their body. And what do we know about inflammation? Inflammation is a silent killer. It is correlated to every chronic disease that you can think of, from cancer, diabetes, heart disease, neurodegeneration, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. It all falls under too much inflammation. So if you look at what the gist of this is, if I don't have glutathione to bind to this, to help me detoxify this, to take this thing, and I'll show you a little further on this, to take this thing from something that is fat soluble to something that is water soluble, right? What's our excretory systems in our body? Through our GI tract, through our skin, through our urinary system. Those are all water-based systems. So if we can't get something to where it's water related, where it likes water, you can't get it out of your system. But to be able to do that, you've got to have certain nutrients in place. You've got to take it through this breakdown process. Now, if that doesn't happen, tissue damage. Well, what do we know about what do we know about medications where there's excessive or long-term use of a medication, right? Why do they even put the warnings on the boxes of even over-the-counter medications? Why do prescriptions come with the inserts in them, right? Because we know over time the accumulation of these toxins are going to promote tissue damage in the body. The medical community acknowledges that, they just don't follow up on it. Why do you go get liver enzymes checked after having to go on a statin medication? It's because it's tearing your liver up. Okay, now, this is a rhetorical question, so don't raise your hand or anything. But how many of you think you're toxic in here? Right? How many of you think you're toxic? It did not take me very long at all to find this information to add into this presentation, okay? This is out of National Geographic, right? Pretty credible, world-renowned publication source. Look at this. Toxins accumulate in Arctic peoples, animals, study says, right? So if you look at this, think about the Arctic. The Arctic is what we tend to consider as a fairly pristine environment, right? We don't tend to think about it as being Houston or some other large metropolitan area, we tend to think about it as nice white tundras, snow caps everywhere. But look at this. These people in these regions are also accumulating toxins in their system. The animals are accumulating toxins. Now let me go one step further with that. Do those people in that region eat the animals in that region? Right? So now the accumulation is twofold. Right? So what our food eats, we have to be concerned about the toxins in that too. Actually, go back. And I wanted to show you this, Center for Science and the Public Interest, more loophole than law, food additives and testing and the approval process, right? You've got to open your eyes, guys, and look at what's going on around you. If you're not paying attention to what's being put on the labels, if you're eating packaged food and you're not paying attention to what's put on that label, then you're toxic, right? You have to know about the toxicity sources and where they're coming from, so first you can avoid them. But again, you can't run from these things forever. I will take any one of you that can come to me and say that I eat a completely organic diet, and if you haven't paid attention to your nutrient status, your individual nutrient status, you have some degree of toxicity, right? And I'll prove that to you in a minute as well. So, just interesting here, arsenic in chickens, right? And I can tell you guys, my family's farm is adjacent to a chicken farm in North Carolina. Everything that you read on this stuff, they do it. I've seen it firsthand. It's not made up, right? The stuff that they put in there, you see a chicken farm, you'll think twice about eating a regular chicken at the store again, I promise you. Now, this is simply saying for us here in Houston, are we toxic in Houston? Well, think about where your major sources of toxicity are going to enter the body at. They're going to enter through your food, they're going to enter through your water, they'll enter through your air, right? Or direct contact in some form or fashion. This is actually coming from NASA. Some would think, pretty credible organization, NASA, right? So if you look at this is the smog in Houston. This is a clear day, right? I actually, when I came this morning, I had to cross 288 on the South Beltway. And I thought, okay, any of you guys have ever been down that path, you look to the right and you can see downtown just kind of straight up 288, right? And I looked out in front of me and it was sunny coming over here. I couldn't see, there was no indication of fog. I mean, it was pretty warm at that point. Any fog we would have had, we didn't have any this morning, but it would have burned off at that point. I looked towards downtown. It didn't look like that, but it was fog over it. I wish I would have had a camera to take a picture of that just to show you on a day like today. Not a day in the middle of the summer where we're all freaking out about ozone levels and all that type of stuff, but a day, any day in a cooler month, we still have this level of toxicity. So if we think we can run from it, we can't. You can't run far enough to get away from this stuff anymore, so you have to know about it. Here's something else. Let me put this in perspective for you. Most of these toxins that we talk about, they fall under the category of what are known as POPs. Stands for persistent organic pollutants. The main two words in that, persistent and pollutant. These things that we tend to encounter now, the large percentage of these things were not even in our environment 30 years ago. So at the time I was born, this stuff wasn't even a real concern for us in the environment. So if we look at it and you kind of look back and reflect on your own life and you think, well, 30 years ago when I was a little younger, I didn't have trouble losing weight. I could manage my weight a lot easier. Now I'm having far more difficulty with that. This is something you have to seriously investigate to understand what some of the limitations on you being able to lose weight now might be. So why should we talk about detoxification? Again, we live in an ever more toxic environment. Many are toxic and don't realize it. I got some really interesting things to show you coming up. The effects of toxins are systemic, right? It didn't just affect the cardiovascular system. It didn't just affect the pancreas and diabetes or just the brain. They're happening throughout the body, right? And disruption of physiological systems. So here's a few examples on this. So if you look at these, polychlorinated biphenyls, don't worry about the specifics on the names on these. These are things that are commonly in our environment that we have to deal with and we have to encounter. Look at this, a number of environmental exposures confer an increased risk of autoimmune thyroid disease. Well, what were we just talking about? Think about this. Your thyroid is, I always think about it real simply. I like to explain it as the brake pedal and the gas pedal, right? If you got good thyroid function, you can match the gas pedal for your metabolism and it's functioning exactly like it's supposed to. If not, you're standing on the brake pedal too much. Your system, if you have an autoimmune thyroid condition, your own immune system has turned on you. It thinks of your thyroid just like a virus or a bacteria or a fungus or any other pathogen or microorganism that you would come into contact with. And it's turning on it, right? And we know that part of the reason that this happens in these individuals is because of this poor polychlorinated biphenol. This is just one example. These a lot of times are labeled as PCBs, is the acronym you'll see for this. You'll see some things that will say, you know, PCB free or stuff like that. This is what they're talking about. Here's another example. Mercury. Mercury accumulates in the thyroid gland. Ms. Duncan mentioned that I have a master's in public health, and for any of you that know anything about that degree, there's 5 different core areas within the study of public health. And the very first area that I delved into, one of my core classes, was in environmental health. How ironic to today's conversation, right? And I remember this very vividly because I was talking to a doctor off of the East Coast, and one of our assignments was to talk about a public health concern. And I thought, bingo, I'm going to talk about heavy metals, right? Because it's probably not my classmates probably aren't talking about it. It'll stand out to the instructor and probably get a grade on it. So as part of the assignment, we had to have a debate with the other members in the class. Well, I posed my point, used some evidence that I had found, made my point about it, and this family physician comes back and starts trying to refute everything that I said. A lot of it was just opinionated, right? I thought, okay, no big deal, this happens sometimes. Let me go find some more research to validate my point. So I grabbed some more research to validate my point, and I send it along, right? Here's my links to my X number of studies to validate my point. Long story short on this, I could have sat there for 15 years arguing this point, and it wasn't going to change anything, right? So bottom line is, if you look at this for autoimmune or for thyroid gland function, what did Dr. Hotze just say? How difficult is it to get someone just to look at you as an individual to understand thyroid function? Just to look at your signs and symptoms and say that there may be a problem, and how difficult it is for them to order a complete profile to fully assess it, much less look at toxicities that you might be bioaccumulating in your environment that may be having a role in that, right? So when we talk about being outside of the box, you can think outside of the box, but this stuff is in your box right now, right? You're facing this stuff whether you want to or not. It's just a matter of whether or not you want to acknowledge it and you want to deal with it. This study almost saddens me. Look at this. We suggest that maternal exposure to phthalates, phthalates are going to be in your plastics, may affect sex steroid hormone status in fetal and newborn stage. Guys, that's scary, right? That's hormone imbalance before you ever exit the womb, right? That's scary. And this is the last one I'll hit you with here. We talked about some of the effects, we've talked about the hormonal system. So hormonal disrupting chemicals here, again, these phthalates, these PBAs, these are things you'll see. But look at what this says. Both are found in almost all humans. A fraction of humans that are just in toxic metropolitan environments, all humans. You can't run from this stuff anymore. Okay? Phthalates, go back. Phthalates are considered to function in essence as anti-estrogens. Anti-androgens. What do androgens do? Androgens help us build muscle. Androgens help us burn fat. Right? I tend to think about these things as what helps support our metabolic girdle. The better your metabolic girdle is, the less fat, the more lean muscle tissue you have, the more calories, the more efficient your system is at burning fat when you're just sitting there at rest. Okay? So we want these. And then it's also labeled as an estrogen. That's something that you'll find with a lot of these different toxins, that they have very estrogenic type effects. So in a male, how many males want to have estrogen-like effects occurring in their system? How many females want to be in an estrogen-dominant state, have estrogenic activity when they shouldn't have that activity? Nobody wants to be in that scenario. And that's what these toxins do. Now, in terms of fat, so when I first got exposed to this, my thought was, I heard the general comment, where do we store toxins? We store toxins in fat. And the scientist in me said, that's great, but I want to see some evidence of that, because we could just all be saying that, right? So I want to see some evidence of that. Well, I will tell you that the study that this picture came from is flat out evidence of that. And I'm going to show you why this happens and why we put it in fat. But here's what happens. when you look at toxins, they are tracked and accumulate to fat. So, as an example, these plastic cups were sitting outside, right? I mentioned earlier that we have to get things in a water-soluble substance. Do water and fat go together? Do they blend together? No. If you guys have ever taken oil and water or oil and vinegar, put them together, you see that they separate. Oil and water, it separates, right? So if I put water in here, what does this plastic have to mimic for it to not go through this cup? Fat, right? So plastics mimic fat in our body. So it makes sense that as these things deteriorate, as they get hot, as they get cold, extremes in temperature cause these toxins to leach into these liquids that we then in turn consume. These toxins that are leached into that liquid then enter our body in a very fat-like manner. And they find their way into fat tissue. Okay? So that's kind of their more direct route. Now, once they get into that fat tissue, then the problems start, right? Because what they're going to do is, and there's two different cells here. Look at what this says above here. This is actually classified as the lean group, and this is classified as the obese category. These are fat cells. And look at what's happening. Notice all these little cells hanging around the outside out here that are not over here in this lean group. What's happening for this category is the immune system has come into play. Remember, I told you the immune system picks up foreign invaders. It picks up things that don't look natural to our body, and it tries to figure out what it's going to do with it. So when that toxin found its way into that fat, the immune system said, that's not ideal. That's not the way that that's supposed to look, and I've got to do something about this. And it starts recruiting in the fat cell, or in the immune system cell. Now, what do these immune system cells do to the fat tissue? They cause it to proliferate. They create inflammation in it. And when they start creating that inflammation, those cells get bigger. And as they get bigger, they look more problematic. And if they become damaged to a significant enough point, the immune system says, now I'm really going in there after you, and I'm going to bring some more of my buddies in. And you've got this whole inflammatory mess that's occurring in the body, and all of these unique features that the fat cells should have, because fat cells are not just about storing energy, right? They're not bank deposits that we can just store stuff in, right? They're more important than that. They're hormonally sensitive tissue. So they're active tissue in our body. So when that fat cell, the communication that it should have to the brain to shut the brain off to say, you're full, or the communication that it should have to other tissues to say, pull that blood sugar out of my bloodstream so it doesn't continue to circulate at high levels and I don't run the risk of becoming a diabetic, those chemical messengers get interrupted. And now the story becomes a different story at that point. So it is extremely important to be able to get these toxins out of our system so that they don't disrupt us and put us on that cascade of inflammation that's going to shoot us down that difficulty with weight gain, but also lead us into chronic diseases. Okay. If that wasn't bad enough, we're going to add a little more fuel to the fire, okay? I thought that was pretty bad. I forgot about this slide. So, toxins promote inflammation in fat cells. Okay, we mentioned that. And if you look at what that looks like, so it says promotes the accumulation of fat in non-fat cells throughout the body too. So it's not just about what it's doing in the fat tissue, it's outside of the fat tissue. You can see where these areas, some of these areas I mentioned here. And then here's the other thing. Have any of you guys ever heard the term leaky gut? Yeah. Right? That term 10 years ago, if you said leaky gut to another healthcare professional, you got the type look, right? So what we know now is that the more toxins you harbor, the more it opens you up for leaky gut. Well, the more you're opened up for leaky gut, the less your barrier systems work to prevent the toxins from coming in the first place, right? So the cascade starts to pile on itself. You get into a vicious cycle. I saw some of you taking pictures. If you wanted to know where I got some of those illustrations from, I can give you this citation here so you can go back and get it. Now, how toxic are you, right? So these are things that we've talked about, but just scan through that list. I'm not going to read it to you. Just scan through that list and you'll see those are things that resonate probably with most of us sitting in the room here. These are things that the more toxic you are, the more likely you're going to have these symptoms. Now, what does it take to have a successful detoxification? Well, first you want to reduce your exposure to toxins where possible. That's kind of the obvious one, right? So easy part there. But then also you want to take a more advanced approach to this. So our detoxification systems require specific nutrients to complete that process. So the more toxicity that you're exposed to, the more strain you're putting on your nutrients, and over time you create deficiencies. What did we say earlier about these deficiencies? If you want a functioning, efficient metabolism that can burn fat, that can keep up that metabolic rate, you've got to have these nutrients in place. They're metabolic spark plugs, right? You want to purging the bowels is not detoxifying. So when someone says, you know, anytime you bring up detox, the question always comes up, well, am I going to be in the bathroom all the time, right? That's not detoxifying, guys. That's purging your system. Most of those things that promote purging your system actually make that leaky gut that we were just talking about a whole lot worse, right? And what does that do long term? It opens the door for more toxins to enter back in. We don't want to play that game. So we're not looking for purging of the bowels, we're looking for true detoxification here. So it's as much about what goes in and what comes out, right? And then balancing your hormones. Just a quick connect on that, the slower your thyroid function is, the poorer your detoxification pathways are going to be. So here's just a couple of, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just a couple of illustrated points to show you how we detoxify here. And you can see, water-based, water-based. These are going to be water-based at the point they enter your system. Water-based, water. You breathe on your hand, right? Or breathe on the window. You see water over time, you can keep doing that, right? So it's all water-based. It's all about getting it into a water-based format. Now, let me actually go one step further with this, because I don't want to put too much in our time here. So when we talk about detoxification for weight loss, you've got to have two requirements for this. You've got to give the body the nutrients that it needs, and I'm going to show you specifically what those nutrients are. And then you've got to shut down the accompanying inflammation. So when we talk about inflammation, remember early on I mentioned glutathione, and glutathione is a very strong antioxidant. And what happens over time is there's an inverse relationship between antioxidants and inflammation. The higher that inflammation goes, the lower that antioxidant status goes. Vice versa, when you bring up the antioxidants, you drop the inflammation. Now how do you know if you have low antioxidant status? You have to do some type of assessment. And here's the difference. This is called biochemical individualism, right? We're all different. Does anybody in this room look identical to each other? No. Are the way that our bodies function identical to each other? No. So how do you know if you have a limitation in the way you process? Is there something that's unique about your environment that causes you to utilize nutrients at a faster rate? The only way you know how to answer those questions is to do some form of assessment that's individual to you. Dr. Hotze mentioned not fitting into these nice ideal ranges, because the ranges are basically set up off the general population, most of which is sick anyway. We don't want to go by those standards. That's not health. Okay, so some of the nutrients that help here with the detoxification process, you'll see some of your B vitamins in here, big names that you'll probably recognize, folate, B12, and then some of the nutrients that keep this inflammatory process low, some of these big antioxidants that we tend to see. Now, here's what it looks like. You get a toxin, that toxin's fat soluble. I want to take that toxin to this intermediate stage over here. I want to make it less fat soluble, right? And what it's going to take to make all that happen, these are all the nutrients that are required to make that happen. Ironically, I challenge every one of you to go do this. Go pick up that Pure Cleanse that's sitting over on that table, and you'll see that it's in there. Right? You'll see that it's listed, these ingredients are listed in there for very specific reasons to support these inherent pathways. The antioxidants that keep the inflammation low. If you've ever heard anybody say, I did a detox, and I had a negative reaction, I felt bad while I was doing the detox process, right? What that individual was not accounting for is the inflammation that comes along with this. Unfortunately, when we take these toxins and we make them less fat soluble, most of the time they're actually more reactive in this less fat soluble stage, right? So you've got to have antioxidants there to stop that from getting out of control. And then over in the second phase, right before we get into a water-based format, you see a lot of amino acids. So think about this, fast. Well, what does a fast do? It takes the protein out. Well, if these are derived predominantly from protein, how efficient are you going to be at detoxifying if you don't have a protein source going in? You're not going to be. Right? There's some variability on that, but it's about 12 hours is probably what you're thinking there by the time that would shut down. Now, I mentioned this creation of these nutrient deficiencies. That slide that I had up there prior, the more stress that you put on that system, the more toxic exposure that you have, the less efficient these nutrients are going to be. You're going to run into deficiencies over time. Deficiencies create symptoms because, again, when your metabolism starts to break down, symptomatically we start to feel things. We start to have aches and pains. We have headaches. Stuff we talk about, low libido, interruption in sleep here, fatigue. These are the things that start to manifest as a part of that. And then how, as an example, does this play out? Well, if I want to get fat into the cell to be burned for energy, I better have carnitine available. Somebody in here tell me what your carnitine status is. None of you can, right? Because you have to know inherently what amount of carnitine is in the cell to see if carnitine will even be of benefit to you. If you run your testing and you don't have a low carnitine, you can take all the carnitine you want to, and it's not going to have a significant impact on your fat loss, right? But if you have a B5 deficiency and you replete B5, B5 is going to turn your metabolism right back on again. Now, this increase in these toxicities plus the nutrient deficiencies, what does this all amount to? It amounts to weight gain. And when we look at these cells, this is what our fat cells should look like. We should have a little bit of fat tissue in our body. It should be nice and quiet. It should have some interaction with other tissues, control blood sugar with the brain, and it should be a nice little orchestra. What happens over time when you introduce nutrient deficiencies and toxicity, that orchestra starts to sound pretty bad over time, right? And ultimately, those fat cells, as a result, they increase in size. So you go from this to this. Now, are you meeting your nutritional needs? Again, everybody's needs are individual here. No two people in this room are the same, so you can't treat them all the same. And you want to look at the testing and not guess about it. The worst thing in the world to do is to guess over and over. Take more B12. Well, what if it's not the B12? What if that's not what's causing your fatigue? What if B1 or B2 are causing your fatigue? What if CoQ10 is causing your fatigue? You have to be able to differentiate that some way. That's frustrating to think that I'm going to do something that is inherently supposed to help me, and I didn't get one bit of benefit from it. Does anybody want to be in that scenario? No. That's frustration. We're looking for solutions here. So the importance of this, and again, where do you think you fit here? The statistics on this show that over half of individuals supplementing continue to have nutrient deficiencies. If the demands that are placed on your body exceed the supply, either from your diet or from supplementation, you're going to be in a deficiency state. You have to account for that. So if you want fat loss, you have to know what your nutrient status is. This is something that you'll see this outside. This is testing that's done at the Hotze Wellness Center. So you can see where exactly you fit in regards to your new overall nutrient status. And then here's something I thought was important, and I think this is something that you don't typically hear. You want to keep the weight off. Who wants to lose weight and then have to turn around and gain it right back again? Right? No. I mean, if any one thing is more frustrating than anything else, it's to have success with weight loss and then to turn around and it be gained right back, right? So when you look at these nutrients on these tests, it's not just about looking at the nutrient itself, it's about looking at how that nutrient is affecting the bigger picture. What's important about this is you can literally look at these, and based on your nutrient deficiency patterns, you can tell someone that over time, if you don't correct these, you're going to have weight gain. You're going to be dancing on a banana peel when it comes to developing diabetes, blood sugar problems, right? So if you want to not slow back down that pathway of running the risk of weight gain again, this is the type of stuff you want to look at. To my knowledge, I actually feel a little fault in this. I can't think of anybody that's telling you predictively that they can predict that you're at risk for weight gain. They can predict where the impairments in your metabolic function are going to be and how it's going to play out. As an example of this, vitamin D. Vitamin D is a big topic right now. Do you guys know that the medical literature says that individuals that are vitamin D deficient will develop diabetes? Not that they might develop diabetes, they will develop diabetes. Right? It is actually in some publications now listed as an anti-diabetic medication. That's significant. That's not just a vitamin that I'm going to take for good health. That is an important cofactor in the overall physiology and function of how your body works every day. So, to put a conclusion on this, how to overcome weight loss resistance. There's two things you've got to think about. We've got to think outside of the box. The world around us has changed. We've got to change with it, right? You've got to look at detoxification. You've got to remove these toxins that are stopping weight loss or inhibiting that process or causing those fat cells to increase in size. You've got to give your body back what is lost from having to deal with those toxins. That's these nutrient deficiencies that manifest over time. So if you put these nutrients back in, you stop the inflammation that's occurring, that's exacerbating this, and you turn your metabolism back on, right? Does anybody not want to turn their metabolism back on, right? Does anybody not want their metabolism functioning at 100%, right? So these are things you want to look at. So weight loss should not feel like a mysterious process, right? I think after listening to some of the things that we're talking about today, there's a very linear process in what it takes to lose weight. It's a very science-oriented process, right? I come from a background where if you don't have the evidence, it doesn't exist, right? The evidence is there to show how we can lose weight and what's inhibiting that. So we want to apply that science to the environment around us. I've mentioned this several times now, but you have to adapt to that environment around you. You have to know what the toxic accumulation is in the world around you. Even when you're eating the best food choices, you have to make the better food choice, right? Even when you do that, you still have some level of toxic exposure. So be proactive and address the ability to detoxify and also monitor your nutrient status here. Okay, guys, I really appreciate your time this morning. Hopefully you had a little different insight on it.